Hello. Hi, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch, and welcome back for the last session of this seminar. We will have 5 presentations, and I wish to remember to the presenter that you will have 15 minutes for each presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes, 10 minutes session of Q&A. At the end of this presentation, we will have a small discussion by Chiara Bodini. I think that these 5 presentations really fit well with what we discussed in the morning. So without further words, I would like to open the floor to the first presentation, which is by Carmine van der Oudeweetering. She is a PhD at the University of Leuven, and she works on development of qualitative methods, methodologies for open education and practices. So, Carmine, the floor is yours. Can you hear us, Carmine?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit struggling still with sharing on Teams. So I think I will just first save it as a PDF file or not. Let me just share it in my PowerPoint screen.
Take your time.
Yeah. Sharing options are okay. Can you see my screen well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for the introduction and indeed for letting me present today with the work I've been developing together with my PhD supervisor, who's now also in the room, Matthias Decuypere. And I think indeed it fits very well with what we discussed this morning. What I will present is from the field of educational sciences, and it's a proposal for an educational methodology in distance education. So I will try to relate as much as possible with the work that's been presented before already, to find some interconnections, and also to open up, as it is a work in progress, our methodology, to open up also some more ideas on how to concretize this methodology. So first of all, I will just briefly sketch the outline of what I will do today. I will relate, first of all, to the call of this seminar, also about digitizing populations during the COVID-19 pandemic, and relate this then to the broader STS literature, give some stage to some problems, which I position at the interface of different disciplines and practice and methods. And then present the proposal as working with distance. So, related to what happened during the pandemic in the field of education, as we all know, schools and universities had to be closed, and new forms of distance education emerged. Also related to this idea of population production, as to intervene in this broken production of graduates, that education could not just be stopped when schools and universities were closed, but it had to go on through modes of distance education. And this implied a relocation of education to people's homes, but as it mainly concerned digital forms of education, also relocation towards screens and platforms. This meant attraction towards new technologies, also gave new stage to new authorities in the field of educational technology. And as more populations were online, studying online, there was also an increase in the data production in the hands of these authorities, which also gave stage to a kind of narrative of the fact that these data produce a kind of a way to prove the effectiveness of digital education. From a science and technology perspective and a digital sociology perspective, as we discussed this morning, but also yesterday, data is seen not so much as a proof, but more as a product and a productive of particular forms of knowledge that are, in fact, coming forward through the interactions between people, technologies, and information. So we don't render them as proof, but more as these interactive, constantly transforming forms of knowledge. What is then specific then also, and the specific problem I also want to focus on about these forms is that, then I quote also from the book Digital Sociology, that the dynamics, so the interactions, become even more consequential given the interactive nature of digital technologies themselves and the ways they involve ongoing dynamic loops between users adjusting actions and infrastructures adjusting information feeds. The particularity of these forms of knowledge, then, if we focus on this statement, is that it brings about closed interactions. So these loops are closed interactions in which it's difficult to intervene for users, as well as it's difficult to intervene as users. And the particular problems that I want to focus on then are both on the level on the side at the different sides of the interface, both on practice and methods. Is that at the side of practice, if we look at social and educational practice, we see continuous student profiling, and through these loops also behavior reinforcement and a population reproduction. For example, if students have these learning dashboards in which they see their own data continuously and they're prompted to act upon their own performance, this also means that they're stuck inside their own behavioral patterns instead of actually being able to let go of these patterns, so to say. So this is kind of like the personalization loop, which can then affect, generate and reinforce unequal practices or inequalities for students. More so, and next to this, it's also, as I said, it's difficult to situate as teachers and students what their agency is, what their possibilities to intervene in these loops are, because so many of these mechanisms are opaque towards the general user. So these are issues at the level, at the side of practice, and then at the side of methods. Also said in the book of the Digital Sociology, as analytic practices are already part of these loops themselves, it means that researchers have somehow need to also engage with those analytic practices of the devices themselves, so they have to step inside the box, the methodological box of the device. And then for the field of education, it's also to render these methods then again also educationally specific, so to use educational concepts and educational processes to research these kinds of devices is another issue added to this. So abundance of different issues presented right now. What the proposal then for the methodology is, and so as I said, it's really a work in progress. Bits are already bits are conceptual and bits are concrete, but on the conceptual level, the proposal is to work actually with the notion of distance, and this is inspired by the work of Lorenzo, who positions distance as through a digital subject the idea of a digital subject. And a digital subject, from her stance, it's not positioned as a representation of a population, but more as a correspondence to an aspect of a population. And how can we see distance in this respect? This means that the subject does not overlap with any one population, but it relates to multiple populations and aspects of multiple populations, and that are at a distance. There are different ways to relate to these different populations. So it's not an overlap. It's more the distance. But it's also this corresponds to a population, but it's also about the generation of of multiple subjects. So from these relations to populations, again, new multiple subjects can emerge through the interaction of a living subject with its interface and the data it prompts. So as she says, so the digital subject comes into being at a distance between a living being and the data pointers, profiles, models, and active propositions that it may prompt. So this means that the distance allows for various ways to produce your own digital subject, and also to have multiple ways of intervening in making digital subjects. Okay, I hope this was clear from the conceptual level, and I hope to also with the visualization to make this notion of distance more concrete. And how do we want to work with this notion of distance in our methodology? Is to work with multiple methodological entry points, as we say. So this means that we take different positions towards user interfaces with different gradients of distance. So one of these entry points then is to assess and query practices with user interfaces. What can we imagine with these practices with user interfaces? In the field of education, we can think of students and teachers actually interacting with digital technologies in their classrooms, in their lecture halls. The concrete methods then to use are interviews or classroom observations or logbooks, not in a very traditional sense, asking about someone's experiences or beliefs or attitudes, but more about the concrete practices with their interfaces. So this is one methodological entry point that allows us to get an insight in the distance between the living subject and the technology. Another entry point is that of practices on user interface, on user interfaces. What can we imagine by that? Is that all that's visible on our screens? Methods that we adopted to assess these are navigations, the active engagement with the screens, clicking and interacting with the screen. This is how this method of navigation is being materialized. And diagrammatic analysis, so to assess the kind of conflation between text and visibility on a screen and the performativity of those visibilities. Then a third entry point is that of practices behind user interfaces. what can we imagine then? That's all the work that's been put into making visibilities, so to say, on the user interfaces. This is, for example, the work of web design teams, of project staff, of these different platforms. And what we've done before is mainly doing interviews with these staff members, but in the future we also want to focus on the data life cycles themselves. So how are data circulating through protocols, through different assessments, and really get a grips of on how these data are in the hands of these staff members. Then a fourth methodological entry point is that of practices beyond interfaces, and that's something that's not to be forgotten, is that these kinds of practices appear in a bigger ecology, which is also mentioned this morning, but also in a political context in which soft forms of governance, so transnational organizations, but also national governments are framing kind of new data policies, but also the actual legal policies that are now in place with respect to data processing at this point. And how to query these are through various policy document analyses. So kind of the idea is, although we have had already practiced these different distinct methods more separate from each other, we really also want to combine these different methods, as I would say, through a process of I don't know. I think I will first show this. We want to combine these different methods as a way to kind of reconstruct the loop forms of data practices, and as a way to bring the distance between these different positions towards user interface back into sight. So that is to reconstruct these different loop forms of data practices, but also to bring the distance back into sight, and to thereby also allow for different interventions in these loops, to gain, to actually, by making this visible, also to rearrange new practices. And this can vary from, on the one hand, rearrange local settings to give knowledge on how data can help students to arrange when and where they can learn with their screens, to help teachers to arrange their classroom practices with screens, and to use data in a thoughtful way in this sense. But also to make new visualizations that also allow this distance to come to the fore, so to show the fabrication of data in some way. Also to develop new practices and policies, analytic practice and policies. So we don't already have concrete interventions in mind, also with respect to the idea that we want to open up this idea of methods as a process of learning, that we don't already have an end goal in mind of what kind of intervention we have that would be best, but rather to continuously learn from our methods, and to also adjust our methods to finally come to new forms of educations, also to allow new populations to emerge through data, new data subjects to emerge, and thereby also to integrate into a methodology the importance of temporality, so how to sequence our different methods, how to feedback our different insights to to different actors in the feedback loops, and also to integrate the importance of situatedness of the place where they are in their local setting, in their transnational policy setting, and so on. So these are kind of the broad ideas that we're working with, and I'm really curious also to hear how it comes across for from other disciplines.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Carmen. So the floor is open for questions.
Yeah. I will also stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay, so there is a question by Noche. Please go on.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting. I was perhaps especially taken by your points about behavioral reinforcement and the kind of closed loops of feedback and data capture in these kind of educational software settings. And I was wondering, like, would it be possible to do perhaps more specific sort of empirical work on what are the formats for intervention that are available? Because I'm quite struck in other domains by this kind of formatting of intervention that, for instance, it's possible to, as a user, one can contact a help desk, or one might be able to issue a complaint, but these formats of intervention are often very specific and sort of set up the intervention in a very particular way, like they're highly formatted. So I thought, could that be a way of sort of further specifying this critical observation that you make, that these structures of behavioral reinforcement leave so little space for intervention?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think for now, for the empirical work that we've done for now, is what's most striking is that it's really about when and where to continue practices. So that's also highly formatted, that every course still has a deadline, still has like a very concrete text box where everything should be fitted in, and that's also a way in which these practices are really formatted. But I think indeed, so there's also more, even more interaction. The practice you point out right now is even more interaction with people too, right? It's not just the kind of square that students are interacting with, but they're actually also interacting with the people backstage. So I think that's something that we only can assess with if we take this dynamicness into account. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Tim, go on, please.
Yeah, maybe just thanks. This looks very interesting. I'd be very curious also to hear more about your, like it always gets, if you take a specific empirical thing and then sort of connect it to a specific issue, I'd be very interested to see how it plays out, but I'm sure that will follow at another conference or moment or in your trajectory. And I think the other thing we were just mentioning in a short lunch conversation I had with Annalisa, if you take this notion of scripts and you go back sort of historically, you go back to its earlier iterations, of course, it was really also about counter scripts and about how people don't follow the format. And of course, we all experience that when we're doing online education and somebody shared their computer rather than their specific presentation screen, and we see all the WhatsApp stuff they're doing at the same time, and all these ways in which the scripts of these platforms are also being challenged and done differently. So I'm just really, that would be an interesting part maybe of your analysis, that the intervention is also already partly ongoing. It's not, maybe it's not only something you would be adding, but also something that's already happening, but you could articulate. I'd be curious to hear any of that.
Yeah, indeed. Also, what was said this morning, that it will be very interesting to see how to involve the actual and how to involve people in making their own transfer. That's what struck me this morning in the conversation. How to involve people in making their own transformation possible if they know what's going on, if they know these scripts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carmen. We can move to the next presentation, which is doing citizen participation in the smart cities, which is by Haugh, Fraaije, and Kupper. If I'm not wrong, Fraaije will be the presenter. Haugh is a PhD candidate at the Vrije University of Amsterdam, and she works on the process of democratization of the smart cities through art and science fiction. Go on, please.
Thanks for the introduction. Yes, Frank is not here today, but he helped me prepare for it. I will share my screen. And let's see if it works. Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, great. And not the notes, etc., right?
No, the notes now.
Okay, great. Thanks. So hi, my name is Haugh. I'm a PhD student at the Vrije Universiteit, and actually I work at the same institute as Teun. Just to clarify, the Athena Institute does transdisciplinary research, which means we always study how to bring different actors together around, I would say, complex societal challenges, even though that's a problematic term. And in my case, I work on the digitalization of public space or city practices, let's say urban management practices. And for the past 3 years, I've been involved in two action research projects in which we've tried to foster a more inclusive, reflective debate about such smart city technologies in Amsterdam between professionals, but also citizens and marginalized groups in particular. And today I want to share with you a quite personal reflection, I think, with you on what we learned by taking this interventionist approach. So by actually trying to do citizen participation in the smart city. So first, why foster the socially inclusive, reflective debate about smart cities? And why did I respond to this call? Because so it's not a digital method, right? I tried, it was quite an analog method. We tried to do citizen participation in real life, but it was about digitalization practices. So digital technologies, they allow cities to generate unprecedented amount of data about their citizens. And there's loads of examples, smart streetlights, smart garbage bins, etc. To give an example, the municipality was at the time working on a crowd management tool in Amsterdam, which means they kind of make a heat map based on camera footage to count the number of people on a square, but also using other types of sensors, Wi-Fi trackers, etc., to follow people around in the city, being able to say, oh, so many people going left here, so many people go right here, etc., etc. And the starting points for our project were, and I call them starting points because I want to reflect on them later. Our assumptions were smart technologies like these, of course, they can make the city more efficient and they can maybe improve safety, or that's at least what those what is the promise. But they also raise citizen concerns about privacy, security, autonomy, fairness, etc., etc. So we furthermore assumed technology professionals, they of course reflect on their practice, they do, but they usually reflect on the practice within their own sphere, their own colleagues. And since their work really it has such wide-ranging effects on society, really that reflection on their practice should occur together with stakeholders and citizens to prevent kind of tunnel vision. And then the idea is that as a result of that, technology professionals, so developers and policymakers, they become more sensitive to societal concerns and in effect take better decisions. And then the technologies that can come out of their development processes will finally be more aligned with societal needs and wants. And this then is the primary tenet, let's say, of responsible research and innovation, that such an inclusive, reflective debate has that capacity. And then we added to that specifically marginalized groups, and that's of course a vague and problematic term, but in this case I'm using it on purpose because we found that well, smart city is very clear that citizen participation is important, but when it's performed, it usually creates a very specific type of public, which is, you know, end user or even producer of data. And it's usually for very specific people. Let's say a tech-savvy, usually male and higher educated elite, it's sometimes called. And we wanted to include marginalized groups in the conversation, not only you know, for the sake of inclusion, not only to give them a voice because it would be fair, but also because the assumption was that the fact that they are marginalized, it sort of means that inherently their perspective is different from the dominant perspective. And that means that their input, that their participation in the conversation could really broaden the debate and broaden reflexivity. So that was the idea going in, right? So how do we do that? Before I start reflecting on all of this. So how do we do that? The core assumption was, you know, people are not actually hard to reach. You just have to go to them. So we went to underprivileged neighborhoods in Amsterdam, where we did first street theater to get into contact with people without actually having to mention the term smart cities. Then we went to community centers in the same neighborhoods to really talk more with people about what was going on and what was at stake for them. And then we invited those citizens, those participants, to also join us in a theatrical dialogue together with smart city professionals who we had previously interviewed and involved in that manner. So this was the general process, and we did this twice, a little bit differently the second time because of COVID and other contextual changes, but this was a general idea. And yeah, so maybe it's good to already mention that each of these steps, of course, were both an act of social research as well as an act of social action, in the sense that we try to, for example, already create some issue publics around smart cities, right? We try to create an issue, we try to create a public, but at the same time, we were also researching what is on people's minds, what is at stake for them potentially. Now, even though I could share with you some fruitful results from this project, right? I could talk to you about who were engaged, what they said, what the smart city professionals did with it, etc., etc. But that's not for today. Today, I want to share with you, you know, what we learned along the way of trying to do this, because this idea sounds good, you know, you just have to go to them. But if it was really that simple, then everyone could and would be doing it. So it really wasn't that simple. And I think we learned the most interesting things about the smart city and participation, but also our own presumptions in a way that we hadn't predicted or that was kind of implicit. And today I want to make that process explicit with you. So let's start with the last point. What do we learn about ourselves? Well, I was confronted, or we were confronted with our own assumptions about inclusion and reflection, exactly in the way that Teun just described, in the sense that, in this case, the citizens, they did not comply, right? And that's how we learned what we actually expected from them. For example, an example was that this really lovely lady, Samar, she was the main coordinator of this particular community center. She said, "Oh, Afka, I'm so thankful that you came here. I'm so thankful for these activities, because they really helped me to promote these digital urban technologies in my neighborhood. And, because people are usually so skeptical and they're so negative and they're always so concerned and everyone is distrusting. So it's just so great to have such a positive and happy, friendly activity that I can share with the neighborhood and spread hope and connection." And at first I thought, oh no, she totally didn't get it. We wanted to foster critique on the smart city. We were convinced that there were public values at stake, and we needed to create a critical audience, kind of a critical public that could form some kind of counter narrative against the dominant smart city drivers. And that's how I found, that's one of the ways I found out that we wanted to establish this critique. And of course, with this interaction, I started to also question that assumption. I started to ask myself, but is it really fair to ask of a person like this to form this counter movement? If ethicists are already very well capable to articulate the ethical, the moral stakes at the public values at stake here, what do we expect from these citizens exactly, etc., etc. So without going into any potential answers there and now, I will if you ask me later, but I just wanted to emphasize here that this whole process of doing the intervention and then being confronted with how people do not do what you expected them to do was very insightful. Then what also happened was something that maybe we celebrated at first, but became problematic also. That we kind of merged with the smart city ecosystem. So at first, we were not really welcomed with wide arms when we arrived in the smart city ecosystem in Amsterdam. The first organization that we approached, it was a network organization, very popular smart city organization in Amsterdam. And they're kind of a gatekeeper of the smart city community. Thousands of companies are related to their network. And we asked them, can we get in touch with companies who want to work with us on this dialogue process? And they said, oh, no, you're doing bottom-up participation? No, we just decided that participation should only come from the companies because otherwise they get overwhelmed. So that's how it started. Then we went on, which is already very informative, right, about how participation normally happens in the smart city. But we moved on, we found we managed to interest them later, they got on board, etc. 1 year later, we find out that at this high stakes dinner where they share the main outcomes of their work, so this network organization, they presented our project as the key outcome, the key success of their work for the past year. So suddenly we were kind of embraced and also became part of this system. And even though this is partially desirable from a transdisciplinary research perspective, because you want to work with the people that you study, it's also dangerous, specifically in the smart city where this, citizen-centric language is so common. So we were worried that maybe they only appropriated the language rather than the practices that we were bringing in. And for example, the municipality, they held an open dialogue a few weeks after we handed in our last report. And even though we were, of course, happy about that at first, this is what it looked like. it was a 90 minutes expert panel, and the open dialogue with citizens was 5 minutes on the program. So that kind of signified for us, like, oh, you know, how critical, how much difference are we really making? And then this is related to my last point. This is related to our combined roles as change agents, but also academics and being contracted by the municipality. This combination of roles kind of, we noticed we started to hold back our worst critique. We wanted to stay on board. We maybe wanted to do a new project with them later. They also paid for us, right, to do it differently. So they expected something from us, that we would be able to get these marginalized groups in the room with them. And we kind of wanted to hold up that reputation, I guess. And as Teun once asked my colleague, you know, he said 8 activists were successful because they were smart and scary. They were scary. Were you scary enough? And I must say that in lots of instances, I felt I wasn't scary. I was always understanding, etc., etc. We did notice that the theatrical dialogue specifically did allow us to ask the important, critical, and sort of dumb questions, because it was based on improvisation theater, and the actors, but also the facilitators, the audience, they were all kind of put in this position where they could ask what was considered, I don't know, they could ask the dumb questions kind of. So that was maybe an antidote to our lack of scariness. So to conclude, as you can tell, these kind of results are very messy, they're heterogeneous, as Noortje Marius yesterday said, in the sense that you can't really allocate, you know, what part of it is smart city, what part is participation, or is our own doing, or our own assumptions. Also, it's normative work, obviously, so it demands reflection. And the concept that helped me there was to look for the disconcerting moments, as Sonja Gerard described. So the moments where you kind of feel like, something's off. People are not responding as we would have expected. And then use that to reflect on your own assumptions. And that's really nice rationally, and it's, you know, to use your body as a research instrument, that's very helpful. And the metaphor that I used sometimes, my boyfriend, he's a Wing Chun practitioner, like he trains Kung Fu, specifically Kung Fu. And the important part of it is the specific attitude where you move forward with full commitment, with 100% being in there. You're serious, you know, you're completely firm. But then once something happens, you're completely pliant. So you completely move with the flow. And I think that's the combination that's required for this kind of interventionist social action research. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Afke. Questions? Claudio, go on.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was thinking to the definition that you had about specific marginalities. So I think that's one of the limits of this kind of project, especially in the smart city framework or frame, where you find a very, very specific and bounded marginality without connecting it with other marginality, in order to create critical mass that will more easily have some voice in policies, easily translated into policies. I don't know if there is some space in your work of research, and how do you think, first of all, if this work is possible or not as a researcher, and if something like this could happen or happened in your experience, in your research, to connect marginalities, not to go on specifically on them.
Yeah. Do you want to collect questions first, or shall I respond to this one?
No, you can answer.
Okay. Yeah, so many. I really love your this idea of connecting the different marginalities. I think in our case, we didn't really reach out to specific marginalized groups. Maybe that's the first. We just went to community centers where lots of these marginalized groups happened to be around. So they were kind of connected. Some groups there were more like people with specific ethnic backgrounds, or there were people with learning disabilities. But I think you're absolutely right that the fact that they're marginalized is not necessarily doesn't make them a public. And they were also fighting my label as a marginalized group. What also happened was that the group specifically had not told me that they had learning disabilities. So I talked to them later, and they said, "Yeah, did you like it?" And I said, "Yeah, of course, it was wonderful." And then they said, "Yeah, did you have any idea that this group had learning disabilities?" No, I had no idea. And then they said, "Yeah, we just didn't want to be addressed any differently, so we didn't tell you." So I think that's really interesting as well, in this goal of trying to involve the marginalized who actually don't want to be called marginalized themselves. I don't know if that's an answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is another question by Manjit. You're mute. We cannot listen.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I was intrigued by the use of theater as a way of thinking about some of the critical questions that come up in smart city research. And I was wondering about the way in which we use stories that people tell us as evidence, as well as a mode of intervention, and basically getting some form of critique, as well as some form of understanding of the perspective that is required in order to understand an alternative framing of the smart city narrative as a part of the intervention itself. So, in a way, theater and improv is one way of doing this, but at the same time, what it does is that it allows us to basically bring these alternative narratives on a platform which kind of is also accessed by the other actors that you were basically in conversation with. So in a broader sense, I was wondering about where you place the role of stories in your research of the people that you were in conversation with, and do you specifically use it as a form of expression when you're doing theater as well?
Yeah, thanks. So for a while, I did use a kind of a narrative framework to analyze what people were bringing in. And it was specifically helpful in designing the theatrical dialogue, because even though it was based on improvisation theater, we did want to talk about something. We had ideas about what the conversation was supposed to be about. It was also a responsibility, right? After all the conversations we'd had with people, with professionals, we had these, 2-3 hours. We felt responsibility to kind of shape that conversation, as well as leave it open for people to bring in their stuff. That's where it was really helpful for me to use this. I think it was by Davies and McNaughton. They have this lay narrative framework of how lay citizens kind of resist new technologies that are difficult to imagine, etc., by making use of these well-known stories like Pandora's box or whatever. And I did use those stories to kind of see how is this dominant smart city narrative being countered by these citizens, and what conflicts are there, and then following from that, what conflicts should we bring on the stage to discuss with our members of the audience. That's how we did it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Afke.
Thanks.
Let's move to the third presentation, which is by Federico Monaco and Haugh. I think the presenter will be Federico. Federico is a researcher at the University of Parma, and his research focuses on methodologies and tools for the integration of technologies of learning.
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon. And for the Netherlanders, goedemiddag. I share my slides also as resource in the chat, and I ask if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So you can look around the slides while I present the slides as well, because there are some links that you might find interesting. It is let's say it is a spin-off project from the simulation lab we have in the Department of Medicine and Surgery. And the idea was also to start a sort of university and society scenarios building with the digital. And it started as a proposal in the district called Pablo Commons, because the name of the district where the hospital and the department are is named Pablo. And this happened before the lockdown. So there was, I've been creating small websites, and I made presentations or little workshops with these websites. Of course, this happened in presence before the lockdown. And the idea was to, let's say, to drop these digital assets and digital practices and methodologies in the district, and seeing what could happen, and so to see how they could inspire and what they were going to be understood by the people, the citizens there, and the associations and the institutions. The idea was to start from children, so there were two small projects. One was about the simulation of communication of sea mammals as a laboratory in the local school, and another one was about another laboratory meant with virtual reality also to the primary school. And this was very interesting because it could be a way to reach out for the families and also for the groups, and starting by children. So going very basic to showing that if children, they can use such technologies and they can do nice things with the digital or supported by website, then of course the adults and the association will be able to do this. And the first remarks were that there were the different agencies at work, and they could hardly communicate, because the school is meant to be a presence or online teaching, and they use mainly paper or digital platforms. Then families and parents, they communicate mostly by WhatsApp, so telephony. And then there were some learning points from the municipality that they were providing support to pupils and students, and they were mainly working by paper. And of course, during the lockdown, there were big problems about this, because there was not a network ready. So it was really a hard time. The metaphor I came out with is the one of the three Buddhas, because there are three socio-technical words: the digital, the telephonical one, and the paper. That they cannot touch each other and they cannot be interoperable. So the question is, can we have a network, and if there are some possible points of distribution, and how can we connect these words? And on the other hand, do we really need to connect such words, or it is a matter of ontology? Because there are not shared ontologies, so they cannot find a way to communicate each other if they're missing the words to use. during the lockdown, some remarks were that the digital emergency for learning was definitely a social fact, because a lot of solidarity and help among people was happening. Also, if the school was not directly implied, and so there were citizens and families trying to help each other using online meetings, or sharing stuff by emails or telephone chats. There is not integration among the agencies for learning, although the common goal is the school's success for pupils and students, of course. And learning assets and issues are tackled in different ways according to different contexts. And the question is out there a plan? Because it's been more than 1 year, and something looks like it's not working, because we're still facing the same problem that were before at the beginning of the lockdown. And during the lockdown, citizens felt less living in a city and more living in a neighborhood by connecting online, because we were having a lot of video conferences in the neighborhood. So we couldn't get out from our homes, but we could meet each other. And also, this was very important, we could make the children meet each other, at least watch one to the other online, and spend some time together and talking, because of course they had to stay at home. Then a key word, of course, is the civic technologies, but on these there is some skepticism to move, because the civic technologies are meant to connect people by sharing free innovation, let's say by a free innovation paradigm. But it's very hard to explain people about it and make them do the leap from WhatsApp to using something that is shareable, that it's open, and start to do stuff by their own. So even by the co-designing sessions, then it's very hard to find somebody that is inspired or is a bit geek and likes to develop and move on, creating an infrastructure for the district or for their cities on their own. And at the end, citizens, they still expect institutions to develop and provide services. Another metaphor I'm using with the citizens, these are the style of the slides are more for really for the audience, for citizens, and I wanted to keep this kind of style by using metaphors. Is the idea of the coral, so to grow outward by making co-designing. So I'm sharing a co-designed canvas that I'm using. And I'm starting from the community of practice idea. Then I'm also adding the infrastructure, which of course needs some critical insight and must be in a certain way. So open, mutable, developing, and regenerative, if you want to provide to citizens to make their own, develop their own digital structure for communication and collaboration. A little bit of ethnography about the public learning centers, because the volunteers of the public learning centers are found in between at the intersection of these three learning agencies in the district. So at the same time, there are amateurs. I mean, they just provide their service just as volunteer, but at the same time, I think we should call them knowledge workers. They provide a public service, so they have public engagement, but they put their own individual values when they do the intervention and when they support children and students. They have an institutional role, but they're just there by circumstances also, or they have a practice that comes out from some, let's say, from tacit or really from the common sense sometimes, because they also have to improvise a lot. Of course, everything that has to do with the knowledge and skills must be situated, so it's related to the other area. But many times they are supporting children that belong to other ethnical groups, or they mostly are familiar with other languages. So these volunteers, they really have to they really need to improvise or also to develop skills, to resilience skills on their own. And of course, these skills are, on one hand, they must be heterogeneous, but on the other kind, you need somebody that really knows how to teach and knows a bit of pedagogy. At the same time, their role is about of care and responsibility, because they have to do a lot with the whole context of the family, of the whole case they take, and really understand how to cope with the child, how to communicate, how to break walls. And at the end, their role is quite invisible, because they don't, they're not so visible like a teacher or like a social worker, but at the same time, they are inside. They represent somehow what is being done for the community by the municipality. So the idea is that they are volunteering in visibility, and let's say my bet with them is also to use the digital to provide a bit of visibility and value, and mostly about the way they are enrolled, about what can be the special requirements for these volunteers, and if and how much they should teach, if we are to consider them as teachers. And a question is if wisdom or common sense, like let's say the elder volunteers have, is still enough to tackle education in a complex and changing world. So mostly what the questions are about the future of public centers now is, are we going back to normal life, in brackets? Shall we design instead for a post-pandemic society? Is the digital a way to open some black boxes on how learning happens? And is it digital a way to make such volunteers much visible and valuable? So some possible conclusions is the fact that we need mostly to leapfrog about best practices and design services for the citizens with the citizens. And can we use this civic technology really to improve the services and for the city and the local community? I found some resistance even to free innovation, and sometimes it's very hard also to explain what we're going to do when we co-design, and if we want to design for long term. And when the question is, shall we go digital and share open data? Mostly of the times the answer is no, let's do a WhatsApp group. So the digital is still perceived and understood as a B plan. Is considered that thing online we have to use. Meanwhile, we come back to normal life. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Federico. Nice presentation, very nice. Yeah, the floor is open for questions. No, Annalisa, go.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Federico, for this extremely rich presentation. So somehow you answered me at the end when you talk about the resistance to innovation. So one thing that I would suggest is avoid specifying it's free. if there is one thing that marketing people teaches, it's that if you organize something free and then you organize it and you have to pay a very high fee, probably you will have more people participating in the second case. So that's I don't know whether it's true or not, but sometimes having free things might not work towards its implementation. That's also true of innovation. But my question is, did you see some, let's say, how would you describe long-term organizational, if not institutional changes, if you spotted anything? I'm referring to how the changing social contract that might have been sown with this experience during the pandemic. So you were quite, you clearly described the conservative attitude towards the end, but can you spot also some changes that might further develop instead of returning to normality, which is also close to what Ivo was saying before. So we shouldn't aim to go back to normality, but we should be able to think the new normalcy. So if you had to see some seeds of this new normality, what would you see?
Yeah, in reply to the free innovation concept is related to von Hippel theory about giving to people technology, open technology, and let them build something by themselves. So it's mostly is related to this. So there is a missing link between the idea and then what they can really provide and rely. So on this, at least on my experience, also with students, it's very hard to come out from the script, let's say. And sometimes also the students, they just want to have the resources and the day of the exam. So just to say it very short. About the second part, some seeds. This, I think there is a big tension. There is let's call it a dialectic tension, because we live in a highly dense digital world, in the sense that most of the things we do now is by using networks for work, for leisure, for trade, but in the learning sector, there is still this feeling just providing content, and I think also at institutional level is it's very difficult to provide a circle and put the problem at the center. But I think that the pandemic has also shown that many prejudices that there were before, also inside the university, meaning that because I'm designing e-learning and virtual reality in the university, and so when I used to talk and explain what was possible to be done by the digital, everybody was saying, yeah, but it's not going to work. I need to stay in the classroom with the students. Otherwise, they will not learn. They won't understand. So I think that if there are some seeds now, is about there are less prejudices towards the digital.
There is another question by Carmen.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting the presentation and also the new practice. And I was also wondering whether, because now it seems like it's either online or either in the classroom, but in what sense are these kinds of educational practice is also not possible in the hybrid form or even in the merged form, that people learn to make these and engage in these virtual spaces while they're together in a physical space, because I can imagine that there's a certain force in the virtuality, but also in the physical presence.
Yeah, about this, I think that first we need to go by designing a lot before we want to provide a class, even if it is in presence. The second is that you need to go ubiquitous. So when you design education, when you design a class, you have to go ubiquitous. I mean, you have to mix up the idea that you have the students or the people inside the room, but at the same time that they have these wonderful screens connected to the web, and so they can do a lot of stuff. And the third thing is that you're not providing any more lessons or lectures. You're providing the environments for experiences.
Thank you, Federico. I suggest to move to the next presentation, which is by Singh. The title is Singh like an Infrastructure, Low Resolution Citizens, and the Aadhaar Identification Project. Ranjit is a researcher at the Data and Society Organization in New York, and his research lies at the intersection of data infrastructure, global development, and public policy.
Thank you so much for inviting me today to this workshop. I'm really sorry because of the time difference. I've missed the initial, the morning sessions of the workshop, but I hope that what I'm going to talk about today is going to, resonate with the ongoing discussions that are happening in this workshop. So I'm going to share my presentation, and I hope you can see it.
Yeah, it's okay.
Fantastic. So my name is Ranjit Singh. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at Data and Society. I'm currently working on thinking through conceptual vocabulary and sites of AI in the Global South. It's a broad project, but I'm still trying to work out the relationships and the nature of it. What I'm going to talk about today is specifically focused on my dissertation research, which is on India's biometric-based national identification infrastructure called Aadhaar. My focus in this talk is going to be on the conundrums of the relationship between identity of people who are subject to data-driven practices, or as we call them, data subjects, and their representation in the workings of a data infrastructure through data records. So while identity broadly conceived is about who you are, representation in infrastructures characterizes your identity through standardized data categories. The interplay between the two raises the fundamental question that I want to explore in this talk, which can be fairly straightforwardly addressed as how do data records mutually shape the identity and everyday lives of data subjects. And as I will illustrate throughout this talk, this question lends itself into a wide variety of concerns that should drive how we think about questions of inclusion, fairness, accountability, and justice in a data-driven world. So I've used this question as an organizing principle in researching and writing about Aadhaar. Over the past 5 years, I've followed the legal, administrative, and socio-technical controversies over the design, implementation, and use of Aadhaar. Aadhaar translates in English to foundation or the basis for something else. In producing an ethnography or this project, I was interested not only in the making of this foundation, but also its becoming the basis of something else. How this something else is articulated, promoted, and ultimately enacted. So in 2010, the Indian government started collecting fingerprints, iris scans, and facial photographs of every Indian resident, along with their basic demographic information, their name, age, gender, and residential address, to give them a unique 12-digit Aadhaar number. I began my fieldwork on Aadhaar in 2015, and here it is important to note that Aadhaar is a voluntary government scheme. You do not need to have an Aadhaar number. It is issued to an Indian resident. Issuance of the number does not guarantee rights, benefits, or entitlements of Indian citizenship. However, the government has also insisted on using it to improve its services, which by extension has made Aadhaar mandatory to access many of its services, especially its welfare schemes. Thus, the number has become a condition for securing citizenship rights in India. Now, this orientation to designing government projects which are voluntary in policy and mandatory by extension is not just limited to India, it's rather a global phenomena. And it's also, and these numbers are simultaneously used by private companies in India, such as mobile service providers, and they use it to deliver their services to customers. So in a way, the Aadhaar enrollee is simultaneously a resident, a citizen, and a customer, depending upon where they decide to use their Aadhaar identity and to what purpose. So I'm going to illustrate this point by using the example of Yogita, who was one of my first field respondents. She spoke to me at length about her troubles in obtaining a marriage certificate without an Aadhaar number. Neither her nor her husband had enrolled into Aadhaar. Skeptical about the project's purpose, they believed that they already had many other forms of ID documents and they did not really need to have another one. But their encounters with the bureaucracy of marriage registration seemed to suggest otherwise. As she narrated her story to me, she ultimately concluded, when you go to these government offices, people have found a new excuse for why they can't do your work. Computers are the new babus. A babu is a Hindi word for a street-level bureaucrat. They will tell you things like, madam, we want to register your marriage, but this computer won't let us. Now, drawing on Max Weber's seminal work on bureaucracy, I think there is a point to be made here about how computer interfaces designed to follow the rules of a bureaucracy act like barbarian bureaucrats themselves. However, I wish to draw attention to the difficulties in securing a data record that not only documents, but also certifies that Yogita is married. The bureaucrats in the marriage registration office agreed to the claim that Yogita is, in fact, married, but she was not enrolled into Aadhaar. Without an Aadhaar number, the computers won't let the bureaucrats document Yogita's marriage. After months of back and forth, Yogita was finally able to secure her marriage registration certificate after the bureaucrats figured out a workaround to key in dots instead of digits in the box provided for the couple's Aadhaar numbers. Yogita was finally able to claim that she was married on her data record for marriage registration. Now, this is a rather mundane story, but what it does is that it allows me to basically talk about how my fieldwork was rife with such ongoing ordinary forms of work that Indian residents as data subjects had to do in order to secure representation in Aadhaar and make it work for them in the process of achieving their desired outcomes, whether it is access to welfare or registering their marriage. And in analyzing this work and following the uneven distribution of the consequences of data infrastructures in everyday life in India, I drew on James Scott's work on Seeing Like a State to develop the analytic framework of Seeing Like an Infrastructure. Framework captures the distributed work of, first, the street-level bureaucrats in administering services, and second, the everyday struggles of low-income data subjects in securing government services. So Seeing Like a State showcases how bureaucratic procedures simplify and reorganize citizens' identities to make them legible to state actors. Simplification and thereby the pursuit of legibility, however, is only the beginning of the process of building and maintaining data systems. It's a start of creation of a data category itself. There is an equally expansive domain of distributed and collaborative work that goes into operationalizing data systems as public data infrastructures. And this work is fundamentally focused on securing the validity and legitimacy of the core data categories that are used in order to basically manage citizens. Now, these categories impute classificatory qualities to citizens. So for example, income is used to represent how poor a citizen is, and then their eligibility to access welfare, for example. So these categories are not only assigned top-down to citizens by bureaucrats, but also they're claimed by citizens from the ground up to access government services. And Ian Hacking kind of describes this using the metaphor of dynamic nominalism in his work on making up people. So counting something as something is a condition for determining membership in a field of things or a group of people. Counting does involve categorical judgments. So in my case, categorical judgments refer to making decisions on what data categories represent when they're used to organize state governance. These judgments predicate the circulation and interpretation of data across diverse databases that increasingly determine membership in and access to government services. And in this sense, certain combinations of data provide more comprehensive pictures of data subjects than others. Visibility afforded by a data infrastructure is not just a method of control and surveillance. It also conditions a data subject's agency, existence, and rights as a citizen. So on the one hand, presence of granular data makes data subjects more visible and produces a higher resolution of data subjects. Resolution is a matter of adjustment and scale. Add, improve, or cross-reference data and resolution increases, rather like a zoom or a focus of a camera lens. On the other hand, absence of representative data renders data subjects and their activities less visible to a data infrastructure. They are at a lower resolution. Subtract, degrade, and delink data sets and resolution declines. Different resolutions create different problems. Higher resolution pose surveillance and privacy risks, and lower resolutions run the risk of marginalization and abjection. So citizenship, especially in my research, manifested on the spectrum of resolution in data-driven organization of state services. So in conceptualizing Singh like an infrastructure, I bring together a more comprehensive understanding of the diverse mechanisms that manifest resolution of data subjects. On the one hand, designing for resolution is crucial for state bureaucracies confronted by the complexity of managing citizens at scale. So for example, the state needs to answer questions like what data is required from citizens to deliver government services, and how can this data be used to improve efficiency of and inclusion in government services? While on the other hand, and these questions are integral to the workings of the data-driven state. While on the other hand, a question of these, an understanding of these mechanisms also offers a toolkit for citizens to approach a different set of questions. How do my actions impact my visibility or lack thereof in core data categories of organizing government services? How can I better fit within or strategically disappear from data systems that constitute my relationship to the state? The spectrum of resolution thus is a map of diverse experiences and struggles of living with data and claiming citizenship through it. It captures the emerging tensions and relationships between organizations, here the state, enacting the role of observers, and users, and in my case, these are citizens, who are observed through data. When the observed are afforded a broader scope of participation, which includes, for example, learning to navigate the network logic of infrastructures, capacity to leave without the penalty of losing access to services, and opportunities to speak back and seek redress when faced with harms, their data can effectively be used to represent lives of data subjects. For computational tools that track behavior, which expect people to behave as if these tools are not there, the lesser the opportunities afforded to the observed in shaping their data, the more oppressive this relationship becomes. At the same time, the greater the opportunities provided, the easier it becomes to game the system. So resolution thus is crucial to mapping the balance of power in relationship between actors that are increasingly organized around and through data infrastructures, and their differential agencies in navigating and negotiating the relationships that are enacted through these infrastructures. Loopholes, workarounds, negotiations, contests, and a variety of emotions that accompany living with data. My research has dealt with it for a really long time, and what I have concluded from it is that I take a widely recognized insight from infrastructure studies as a starting point that for most infrastructures work the same way, but for others, they break down in uneven and distributed ways. In following this uneven distribution of breakdowns lies a challenge that increasingly is resolved by calls to focus on the everyday experiences of data subjects. I argue that unpacking these everyday experiences requires close attention to the life chances of data subjects as they are mutually shaped by how they're represented through data. Neither are data records static representations of data subjects, nor are data subjects passive recipients of data-driven decisions. So then the question becomes, what are the new conditions of living in a data-driven world, and how do they emerge in contests over securing representation through data? Thank you.
Thank you, Anjit. Perfectly in time. I see already a question, if I'm not wrong, by Tim.
I didn't have it up yet when you said I see a question, so maybe somebody else was first.
I think I saw your hand.
Okay. You saw it before I did it. This is scary surveillance. Yes, thank you so much, Ranjit, for a super interesting talk, and especially in relation to the question that you raised at the end. I was really curious if you could say a bit more about what made Yogita take the burden of not just taking the number. Also in relation to Federico's talk about, you try to do something that's shareable or protected or whatever, and people say, no, we do a WhatsApp group. We have the exact same problem now. We try to get to expert conversations around the COVID guidance vaccination. We're finding out they're only taking place on WhatsApp. So now we're trying to get into them all to opt into sharing their WhatsApp conversations, which is of course a nightmare. But what made Yogita do it?
I think that's a great question. There are two aspects to this problem. One is that there are ways by which the state can mandate certain forms of action. So especially in the context of India, one of the things that is happening in this dynamic is that there is a Supreme Court ruling from 2006 which mandates that all marriages need to be registered, and this was done mostly to protect women's rights and to ensure that they can basically claim that they are married to a person. But at the same time, mandating doesn't really resolve quite a few of these problems, right? Part of the challenge is basically, does securing representation on a data infrastructure actually allow me to do certain things better? Or, for example, in the case of securing welfare benefits, how the Indian state was able to get a large-scale participation was by basically saying that, you simply won't have access to subsidized food grains if you are not enrolled into Aadhaar and are willing to share that number with the bureaucracy of public distribution system of subsidized food grains. So I think the state in that sense plays a very major role in mandating certain forms of actions and making citizens or turning citizens into data subjects in the first place. But at the same time, there's this other dynamic which is kind of centered on what can I do with data to secure a different life? And that to a certain extent emerges from, a parallel research that I've been doing on how people deal with credit scores in the United States, right? So credit scores are a way of not only organizing, formal economy of the United States. It's used to hire people, it's used to rent places to them. It's a variety of different things that get increasingly connected to a data system as a way of then organizing everyday life. So in that sense, now everybody, especially people who struggle to improve their credit scores, have to work on improving it one way or the other, because they know that, whenever they need to rent a new car, or, they need to buy a new car or make any major life decision, this number will be a condition for them to actually secure opportunities. So in that way, as these systems increasingly become the infrastructure of operationalizing everyday life, people must and do end up engaging with them one way or the other.
But sorry to follow up, but Yogita didn't.
She did.
Oh,
yes.
she did. Sorry, I thought that you said that they needed to find out the workaround of the dots, and only then it could work. So
Yes, you're right. She didn't, but that also means that Yogita already had access to other forms of identity. It also means that she could exercise a certain amount of social capital that was already with her in the process of basically, trying to get her marriage registered without the number. So for a person, for example, who is simply trying to secure subsidized food grains, that might not be an option in the first place, right? So this is the unequalness of this particular issue that I'm currently interested in actually mapping. And that's why I use resolution as a way of thinking about what the spectrum looks like and who kind of is on the spectrum and where they are in a way.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, go on, Gavin, sorry.
Let me turn on my video. Thank you for your talk. And I was wondering if you also look into maybe historical examples where similar discussions happened. So I'm from the Dutch context, and I have written a little bit about a big privacy discussion that happened in the 70s when the government started with this social security number.
Right.
All Dutch citizens needed a number to communicate with the government. People hated it. It made them think of the Second World War and how the Jews were treated. So there was a large discussion. People refused to enter the census that year. So no one, a big portion of the Dutch population refused to participate in the census. So, and one of their slogans back then already was, once you have entered the computer, you can never leave.
Right.
You can still find pictures in newspapers that will show people having those signs in the 70s, in 1971 to be exact. So I was wondering if you, I mean, India must have gone through several of these stages, right? So are there historical parallels here, and are they also informative in terms of how you can deal with these situations?
Absolutely. I think there is an interesting feature of Indian identity documents, which is that during colonial times, the British government was very much interested in documenting a lot of things about Indians, but they were never interested in making an identity document. So the nature of a universalized ID document in India only emerged after independence. And that too, the first formulation of it was basically a voter ID. And interestingly, as the history goes, Indians actually became voters first before India became a republic, right? So the voter ID list was issued earlier in the 1950s before, India became a republic in the first place and held its elections, which was necessary in the first place. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Aadhaar actually is the first attempt of the Indian government to basically document everybody in the country. It was kind of portrayed that way. There's a whole lot of rhetoric around inclusion and the idea that this number is to be issued to kids as well and not just adults in the country. So there's this larger narrative which is kind of focused on how identity in India is so distributed across a variety of different bureaucratic offices, and every bureaucratic office has their own identity document. So if you want to have access to subsidized food grains, you had a ration document. If you wanted to vote, you had a voter ID. If you want to pay income taxes, there was a permanent account number ID. So, every institution every state institution in India had their own ID documents. And Aadhaar is the first attempt at basically collating all of this and basically building a root identity of sorts, which could be used as a way of then seeding and producing more derived identities, which would be paying an income tax, driving on the roads and stuff like that. So it kind of merges into this larger narrative of what it actually means to actually have IDs. And this conversation to a certain extent happened in the United States in the 1920s and 30s when the social security number was created, happened in Europe in the 1970s. It's happening in India right now. but it always becomes a way of, the initial part of it is always a lot of resistance. But increasingly, you would notice that, people use BSN number in Netherlands all the time, right? It's not controversial anymore in the same way as it was in the 1970s. And I find that to be a really fascinating part of this particular issue in terms of, people have to make this work for themselves. And when they do, it kind of becomes a part of everyday life, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashid. So now I would like to invite Chiara Bodini. She will be our panel discussant, and she will help us to wrap up after this very interesting session. Chiara is a researcher at the University of Bologna. She graduated in medicine, but then she completed a PhD in public health with a thesis about health and social movement. And yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's been really a privilege to participate. I tried to follow since the morning. And yeah, I'm a medical doctor by training, so kind of far from the field that most of you work in. But I had then the opportunity to move from a clinical work to public health environment, and then as Ivo mentioned this morning, to work in a highly interdisciplinary environment for the last almost 15 years, 12 years. And so I could relate to many, I think, key aspects that were shared today. Just to mention two things that I really relate to. One is the idea of interaction, so of work in knowledge generation that aims to that acknowledges its interference with the social world and aims to contribute to some sort of transformation. And the other thing is the reflexivity that I think permeated many of the inputs I heard today. So the awareness of the fields that we inhabit and the interactions that we produce. And this is not given for granted. I mean, trust me, from coming from a medical education setting, yeah, it's really a relief when you're in an environment where people can reflect upon their own assumptions. And so we shouldn't give it for granted, I think. And I think it's a plus of the interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches to research and to knowledge. So this I liked very much. I also liked, and again, sorry for being a bit naive in this, but the focus of this workshop and of the project about digitalization, and digitizing people, and how this digital infrastructures enact citizenship and rights of people is very interesting, and I think it's very relevant also for what we are trying to do at the Center for International Health that deals with health rights, and probably we should continue some discussions on possible collaborations. I think in Italy, some of the processes that are still taking place, but they are accelerating a lot, and I can witness it even from a, let's say, a lay perspective from different from yours. But if I can see, as some of you accounted about how digitalization has impacted citizens' rights and the possibility to access services. So if you take health, I mean, I've been besides being a researcher, I'm also a health activist, and I also worked for many years with undocumented migrants, which struggled so much in accessing services. And I could see how the transform, I mean, it's something very simple, but how the because it relates to what Ranjit was saying about the computer being a bureaucrat. And, so undocumented migrants, they have the rights to access healthcare services in Italy, but this right is not structured in official practices. So it's written in a law, but then there are missing procedures that guide professionals on how to do this. And so until a few years back, where digitalization was not so pervasive, there were a lot of holes through which undocumented migrants could access healthcare. through compassionate or like-minded or willing professionals that acted in a positive as gatekeepers, as gate openers. But increasingly, this is reduced by the need to have a digital identity, to be able to open that computer space that then makes the right accessible. So I think it is very relevant to look at these aspects. And so just to scroll back on the presentation that we heard today, just what I capture most. I mean, there were two talking about education. I think also that is very, very relevant. Again, we've been seeing in Italy in the last year and a half how the digitalization of education and the moving to online and distant learning has increased inequalities, as you mentioned. A lot of the response of the welfare response in Bologna was delivering devices to households that did not have enough tools to connect and follow the school that was provided online for children. But I think both contribution we're looking at how in a way we can look at the interaction between users and the digital space, trying to in a way reinforce also the agency of the users, and how these feedback loops was in the talk of Carmen, how they can be made more accessible in a way, and then in the talk by Federico, the idea to to support and to construct networks for greater accessibility and co-productivity of the digital space, which seems to find some resistance also among users. But it would be indeed a significant change from the current state. Then we had probably the talk by Haugh about the action research in the smart cities design, and I really appreciated the capacity to look back at what happened in that effort. And I think it was among the talks I heard today, the one that probably was closest to the work we're trying to do here, in the proximity that it represented between researchers and the public and marginalized groups, and also at the boundary between action and research. I think it's very, very challenging, but to me very interesting, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we had Rajit about the Indian system of Aadhaar, the concept of data subjects, and all the again the interplay of that with citizens that resist it or use it for their purposes, and what is that producing. And then the last, also the most in a way scary talk about the grid system in China that we just heard. So going back to, I think, what was also the discussion this morning about how our methods and our knowledge interacts with the forms of society and citizenship that are around us. I think that I really liked also the keynote by Toon this morning, and two things that struck me. He said, no, we should not be sentimental, and then we should be ready to prove our assumptions wrong. And I want actually to how can I say, not disagree a little bit on the first one, but I think that's related to my story. So I said I'm a medical doctor, and I've moved from looking at health as an individual characteristic that's shaped by genes and bad luck, to something that's fundamentally societal, and that's strongly related with the position that a person holds in society and the resources that he or she is able or is enabled to reach. And I think that there is a serious bias in the way health is looked at and is is taken care of by medical professionals and by societies as a whole. And so in a way, I cannot be unsentimental in taking a position saying that health is fundamentally a matter of social justice, and that unless we consider privileges and disadvantage as fundamental categories, and we basically position ourselves on these in this scenario. Yeah, for me, I mean, it is very relevant to then understand the direction that you want to give to your work. On the other hand, I totally agree on the second aspect of being ready to be challenged. And I think that the framework that we use at the Center for International Health is not particularly new. It's participatory action research. But I think it is quite interesting in allowing for both of these things to happen. So on the one hand, be clear about, and actually Toon did say so. I mean, he said, I am clear about where I am, and so. But I think also taking sides in a way, and on the other hand, be ready to be challenged. I think there were several testimonies here from the resistance in using WhatsApp groups to the smart city example, where people were happy to finally be connected with the city and did not want, the critical part of the thing. But two things. I mean, the thing is, in this framework, I think, and there is an issue that maybe was not so prominent, or maybe I couldn't read it so upfront. It's the issue of temporality and engagement. Participatory action research, at least in the way we conceive it, and it does have a lot of limits. Maybe we will have a chance to talk about it in another occasion. I think it requires a long-term commitment with the people you work with, which means establishing relations that go well beyond, the interaction in the research setting that you created, and extend to a lot into personal life and personal time, and this brings into questions a lot of other sets of skills and challenges that as a citizen that is a person, and then has a knowledge, as a researcher has a technical knowledge. But in the first place, I think they call into question our being people in a society that use some sets of skills to do what they believe can contribute to a greater or more equal well-being. I think Federico spoke about how designing a digital learning environment is creating a setting for experience, and that reminded me of Fraaije. He used this concept of and it's actually a lot of linked to participatory action research, how we learn together through the mediation of our world, of our experience in the world. So it's about creating settings where we can mutually experience something and then make sense of the knowledge that we co-create. But then this brings to the point of what we do with this knowledge. How so the generation of knowledge can be in a way more democratic, and then the use of that knowledge deals a lot with the structures of power in society. And I think somebody made a comment about building a critical mass, like not targeting specific minority groups, but trying to to move across those and to see if a more critical mass can be created. And this, I think, is quite a challenge, but also leads to the question of accountability of we as researchers. To whom are we accountable? And I don't know, I think each of us could respond to this question in a different way. For me, the link with social movements, and so with people who have a critical stand on some issues, and who animate struggle for a fairer redistribution of resources, is quite real. I mean, I believe that there is a potential for transformative change in collective movements of people, and that a a strong, let's say, dialogue and relation between knowledge generation and such movements is key. I think, how am I doing with time? I should probably end.
Yeah, you can have 5 minutes more. There is no problem if you want to add something.
Even more, because
even more than 5 minutes. I mean.
Oh, okay. Oh, I don't want to bore you.
No, but yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, I just wanted to share what we're trying to do and just how it relates with some things that have been shared today. So we're I think that we are doing this action research on health inequalities in Bologna, and we did the first phase of mapping of health inequalities across the city. So an epidemiological survey of how health outcomes and access to health services distributes across city areas, and how it correlates with indexes of social deprivation and, let's say, socioeconomic disadvantage. And then we use this data to inform a second phase of qualitative ethnographic research in selected areas of the city to basically work on the local determinants that reproduce health inequalities and try to engage local actors and try to support policies oriented at intervening on them, on the premises that health inequalities are not just related to the individual determinants or the intersection of multiple layers of disadvantage, but they also have what's called the neighborhood effect. So they also interplay with the area in which a person lives, and vice versa. Acting on the neighborhood, on the context, has potential to counteract some of the individual disadvantage. And this has a lot to say to local policies, I think. And so we're trying to see if this kind of design can inform local policies in a way that's more that take more into account equity and health promotion. And why I'm explaining this, because I think that from now on, if we can continue this interaction, it'd be interesting, because I think we have came across a lot of systems to collect data about population in this research, but we have never, I think we are looking at them as asides, so as relevant asides, but not in a more coherent way. And I think that from today, I gathered that it would be actually important to see them as an actor in the scenario that we are describing. And maybe one thing that I didn't see mentioned, but we are seeing a lot, is how public officials use these systems in a very diverse way. So I think we heard a lot today about the system to collect data and how citizens or users are resisting or using it, or moving aside, or but then there is also, and I'm sure you know, the people who operate the system, and a lot of layers of agents that from the one who inputs the data to the one who reads them, and there is a lot of there would be a lot to say, but just I wanted to give you just two examples that we came across in our research very briefly. I told you we use maps to plot the health inequalities across the city, and it wasn't a specific focus of our research, but it would be very interesting to just because maps are much easier to read than tables or files or everything, and so people basically interpreted them in very creative ways. So it's interesting when we showed these maps to the so the maps are reporting epidemiological data, right? But they were interpreted and used to describe basically pre-assumptions or I mean, just people were using the maps to represent their own view of the reality rather than trying to learn from the map or learn through the map. And another example was about COVID-19. Severe lack of data from underrepresented populations, which was completely unaware. So we were given these lists. Ivo mentioned that we were asked to support the public health authority in the critical phase of the pandemic. So we're given these lists, and we're trying to ring up people looking for the more vulnerable and marginalized to try and see if they had problems in accessing health services. And it ended up that nobody was on those lists. So people from underserved communities were probably not being reported or reporting. They were afraid, did not have the information. We still don't know. It's a multiple array of contexts. But the thing is that from the data in the first wave of the pandemic, there is a serious gap in people from migrant communities and generally speaking, people from low income settings. So this was it, I think. Finally, just really to conclude, I think this issue of how the digitalization is interacting and acting with citizenship is crucial. I think it's very conflictual. Probably this conflict is not very open, and so maybe our role, your role, my role as learning from you would be to look at the fractures in between. This was also another concept that I think is quite interesting, and also how we can bring the public into these fractures in order for that to become more democratically scrutinized and therefore open for a change in the direction of, I would say, equity and participation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. It was a very, very inspiring closing, I think. And now I leave the floor to Annalisa for the conclusion.
I stay here.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Chiara. That was really great, because I was actually thinking, I will be very brief in my conclusions, but I was thinking to articulate around the distinction between populations and publics that emerged started emerging yesterday, and you just finished your last sentence with this reference, so I feel entitled to use this distinction for the conclusions. I think in these 2 days we managed to start a dialogue that moves between these two understandings, one of populations and the other one as publics. Yesterday we started by posing the most evident distinction between the two, populations as enacted and passive, and publics as more proactive and engaged. And we agreed somehow to that we need to go beyond this this distinction, because the methods that have emerged and are still emerging allow to resistance, or at least to see let's say this distinction blurring a bit between populations and publics. I think there have been many threats that emerged during these 2 days, and I won't bother you by summarizing them. The videos will be recorded and available on YouTube, so on the Alma AI channel. That will also be available on the Process and Citizenship website. So let me share it with you. Once in the very next day, we will try to make them available there, if not as not embedded, at least the links. Yes. No, I've just done it, but several times, and that was not very good. So the just to thank you all for participating in these 2 days. For us, as a research team, this was the first major event organized in 1 year, as for most of you, I guess. So it was the opportunity for us to come out of the shell, if you want. We've all been suffering in different ways from the current pandemic. And let me thus thank the team members. So Lorenzo Olivieri, Chiara Luschi, Andrea Petrachin, Wouter Barrosse, and Jan Lausberg for keeping up during this period. As many of you have pointed out, it has been a difficult period to conduct fieldwork research, for example. And Great thanks to these persons who organized the conference. And I also would like to thank those participating. Despite what at first sight might have been seen as an heterogeneity of research experiences, I have found that in this heterogeneity prompted a dialogue that took place at a deep level. And to have that, the generosity of the speakers and presenters was key. So thanks to the keynote, Noci Mares and Teun Zadran-Dierak, but also thanks to the speakers, Elena Esposito, Giulia Andrighetto, Aldo Gangemi, Alessandro Pollini, Ivo Quaranta, and Chiara Bodini. I really appreciated your generosity, and I hope the participants could enjoy this richness as well. And also you could bring with you the sense of a performative dialogue that can be further in the next months. As to us, as I said at the beginning, we will organize events at least until 2023. So you are very welcome to join us and in person, and also very welcome to use the outcomes of the research of process and citizenship that you can find on the website. So the Ontology Explorer, you have the direct link, but soon the link will also be in the menu, and also the publications that came out and are coming out in this period. So I hope to host many of you soon here in Bologna. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.